I'm Brandon Mitchell. I'm 34 years old. Until that Tuesday evening in early September, I believed my life in our townhouse in Charleston. South Carolina was stable, predictable, and solid in the way you assume a 4-year marriage is supposed to be once the honeymoon phase fades into routine. Lauren walked in around 6:30, heels clicking against the hardwood floors, her laptop bag hanging from her shoulder, and there was something deliberate about the way she set her keys down on the entry table, like she was placing them carefully for an audience. She didn't kiss me hello. She didn't ask what I was cooking. She stood there in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, shoulders squared, face composed, and said in a tone so calm it sounded rehearsed that she needed a week to herself to figure out who she was and what she wanted from life. The way she said felt scripted, like she had practiced a cadence in her car before walking inside. She mentioned her co-workers at Brightline Marketing, said they had been talking about emotional independence, and that healthy couples sometimes take breaks to reset and reconnect. She framed it as growth, as self-discovery, as something mature people do when they care about their relationship enough to protect it from resentment. She kept using words like clarity, space, and perspective, and every sentence sounded polished, almost corporate, as if she were presenting a campaign strategy instead of asking her husband for distance. I watched her hands while she spoke because I couldn't focus on anything else, and she kept twisting her wedding ring around her finger, sliding it halfway off and pushing it back on again, over and over, like it was too tight or too heavy. She avoided eye contact almost entirely, her gaze drifting to the wall behind me or down to the floor, and that small detail made everything feel wrong. If this were really about self-growth, she would have looked at me. She would have tried to reassure me. Instead, she spoke like she was reading from a prepared statement, anticipating resistance. She said she would stay with her sister Megan across town, that it would just be 7 days, that I shouldn't overreact because this wasn't abandonment. She emphasized that word, like she knew it was the one that would sit in my chest the heaviest. She said she loved me, that this wasn't about another person, that she just needed to understand herself better outside the roles of wife and employee. The repetition of those phrases made it clear this was not spontaneous. It felt like conclusion she had already reached days ago, maybe weeks ago, and I was just now being informed. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I stood there with a wooden spoon still in my hand, the smell of garlic and butter hanging in the air, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach. The townhouse suddenly felt too small and too quiet at the same time. Every detail stood out with painful clarity. The ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the evening light filtered through the blinds. She watched me carefully, like she expected me to explode so she could point to my reaction as proof that she was right to need space, but I didn't give her that. I nodded slowly and told her that if she needed a week, she could take a week. The moment I said it, I saw something flicker across her face that wasn't relief. It was almost disappointment, as if she prepared for a fight, and I had ruined the script. That was when I understood that whatever this was, it had been building long before she walked through the door that night, and I was the last one to know. Instead of begging her to stay or try to negotiate the terms of this so-called break, I agreed with a level of calm that surprised even me, and I told her that if she truly needed space to decide whether she wanted this marriage, then she should take all the space she needed, not just a symbolic week that would hang over both of us like a countdown timer. I watched her expression carefully when I said it, and for the first time that evening her rehearsed composure faltered. I walked past her into bedroom, opened a closet, and pulled down her large navy suitcase from the top shelf, the one we use for vacations and holidays, and I sat on the bed with deliberate steadiness. She followed me into the room, her voice suddenly sharper, accusing me of overreacting and twisting her words, saying she had only asked for a week, and that I was escalating things unnecessarily. I ignored the accusation and unzipped the suitcase slowly, the sound of the zipper slicing through the silence louder than it should have been. I began folding her clothes with methodical precision, stacking blouses, jeans, workout leggings, and sweaters in neat piles before placing them inside. My movements were controlled, almost clinical, because if I let emotion seep in, I knew I would either shatter or say something I could not take back. As I packed, I laid out the timeline in a calm, measured voice, not raising it once. I mentioned the late nights at the office that started becoming routine around March, the sudden enthusiasm for staying after hours on urgent campaigns that somehow never resulted in overtime pay. I mentioned the gym obsession that appeared out of nowhere in early summer, the expensive new athletic wear, the protein powders lined up on the kitchen counter, the 2-hour evening workouts that left her coming home flushed and distant. I mentioned the way her phone had become an extension of her body, always face down on the table, always taken into the bathroom, always locked with new passcodes she never shared. I talked about the emotional distance that had been building for months, the way conversations turned shallow and mechanical, the way she stopped reaching for my hand on the couch, the way she would stare at the television without really watching it. I explained that when someone asks for time to think about life, about who they are and what they want, it rarely exists in isolation from the person they married. It usually means they are questioning the marriage itself, even if they are not ready to say out loud. I told her that I was not stupid, and I was not blind, and that this request did not appear in a vacuum. She insisted again that it was not about us, that it was about her personal growth, about feeling lost and needing to reconnect with herself. But as I folded another sweater and placed it neatly into the suitcase, she hesitated and admitted in a quieter voice that maybe it was about us a little. That single concession shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. The word little echoed in my head with a weight far heavier than she seemed to intend. A little doubt in a marriage is not little at all. It is a crack that widens quietly until the foundation gives way. Her confidence unraveled the more methodical I became. She paced between the bed and the dresser, running her hands through her hair, telling me I was taking this too far, that I did not need to pack so much, that she had only planned to be gone 7 days. I kept folding, stacking, and arranging her belongings with deliberate care, adding shoes, toiletries, and even a small framed photo from her nightstand, so she would not have to return for it. The calmer I remained, the more unsettled she grew, as if she had expected tears or anger and instead found resolve. I was not yelling, I was not accusing, and I was not pleading. I was simply acting on the reality she had placed in front of me. If she needed space to decide whether she wanted this life with me, then I would not confine that decision to a week. I would not sit here suspended in uncertainty while she weighed my worth. By the time I closed the suitcase and stood upright at the foot of the bed, her breathing was uneven and her eyes were wide with something that looked very much like panic, while I felt an unexpected clarity settling over me like a cold but steady hand. She left that night with the suitcase I had packed, walking out the front door with a tense kind of dignity that felt performative, like she still believed this was temporary, and that within a few days I would call her, apologize for overreacting, and ask her to come home. I did not stop her. I stood in the doorway and watched her taillights disappear down the quiet Charleston street, and when the house finally settled into silence, it did not feel chaotic or broken. It felt clear. There was an odd stillness in the air, like something dishonest had finally been removed. About an hour later, after I had cleaned up the untouched dinner and rinsed the pan in the sink, I noticed her laptop still sitting open on the coffee table. The screen had dimmed but not locked, and her profile photo was visible in the corner of a messaging app. I had never snooped through her devices before. In 4 years of marriage, I had never felt the need to check her phone or her computer. Trust had been the one thing I thought we still had, even when the warmth faded. But the circumstances had changed the moment she admitted it might be about us a little. That crack in the foundation justified looking at what was underneath. I sat down slowly, almost ceremonially, and moved the trackpad. The screen brightened, revealing her social media tabs and messaging apps still logged in. There was no hesitation in my hands. Only a steady curiosity mixed with something heavier in my chest. I opened her direct messages and scrolled. That was when I saw his name repeatedly threaded through months of conversation. Ethan, a co-worker from Brightline Marketing. I recognized the name vaguely from passing mentions at dinner, casual references to team projects and brainstorming sessions. The earliest messages were professional and harmless on the surface. Discussions about client presentations, deadlines, revisions. The tone shifted gradually, so gradually that if you were not paying attention, you might miss the slope entirely. Compliments started appearing between work comments. He praised her creativity, her eye for detail, her energy in meetings. She responded with gratitude that felt warmer than necessary. Within weeks, the exchanges turned personal. She began complaining about being tired at home, about feeling bored in routines, about feeling unappreciated and trapped in expectations she never chose. He validated every complaint, telling her she deserved excitement, deserved to feel alive, deserved someone who saw her fully. I read message after message where she described our life in a way I barely recognized, reducing our marriage to monotony and obligation. She painted me as distant and predictable, as if stability were a flaw. Ethan's replies were careful and strategic, never overtly crossing the line at first, always positioning himself as supportive and understanding. Then the intimacy intensified. They joked about inside references only they shared. They talked about drinks after work that were not mentioned to me. They discussed how some people settle too young, and how frightening it is to wake up one day and realize you chose comfort over passion. My jaw tightened as I scrolled the conversation from the night before she asked for space. The messages were time-stamped just past midnight. Ethan wrote that his apartment was always open and she wanted to see what else was out there, phrasing it casually but with unmistakable implication. He said, "Sometimes you need to step outside the life you built to know whether it is truly yours." She responded that she had been thinking about taking a week away, that time apart would help her decide what she really wanted. He replied with a simple line saying he would be there. I sat back on the couch, the glow of the laptop reflecting off the darkened room, and I felt the final piece click into place. This was never about self-discovery or co-worker-inspired growth strategies. It was not about clarity or perspective. It was a calculated trial run, a controlled experiment where she could test a different version of herself with another man while keeping the safety net of our marriage intact in case it did not live up to the fantasy. The week she framed as healing was nothing more than an audition for a replacement. The next morning, I woke up to the vibration of my phone rattling against the nightstand, and for a brief second, I forgot everything that had happened. But then I saw Lauren's name filling the screen over and over again, and reality settled back in with a cold steadiness. There were texts stacked on top of each other, missed calls, voice messages, paragraphs sent in bursts like she'd been pacing somewhere unable to sit still. She wrote that she overreacted, that leaving so abruptly had been impulsive, that she missed me and hated waking up somewhere else. She said my silence was cruel, that I was shutting her out when she was trying to process her feelings. 24 hours earlier, she claimed she needed space to rediscover herself, and now she was demanding connection, as if I were the one withdrawing. I did not respond immediately. I read every message slowly, noticing the shift in tone from confident independence to anxious urgency. She kept repeating that she loved me, that she never meant to hurt me, that she just needed reassurance that we were okay. The irony of that statement did not escape me. She had positioned herself as the one evaluating whether our marriage was worth continuing, and now she seemed unsettled that I was not scrambling to secure my position. After nearly an hour of watching her messages continue to appear, I decided to call her. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice already trembling, as if she had been crying or preparing to cry. She started talking immediately, saying she had thought about everything all night and realized she did not want to lose what we had. I listened without interrupting, letting her words spill out in a rush of justifications and soft apologies. When she paused to breathe, I said one name calmly and clearly, Ethan. There was no immediate denial. There was no confusion or defensive question about what I meant. There was only silence stretching across the line, heavy and revealing. I could hear her breathing shift, the subtle intake of air that comes when someone realizes the version of events they prepare to present is no longer viable. That silence confirmed more than any confession could have. When she finally spoke, she did not address him directly at first. Instead, she accused me of violating her privacy, of going through her laptop without permission, of crossing a line that should not be crossed in a marriage. Her voice sharpened, clinging to indignation as if it were a shield. I let her finish before responding. I told her that emotional cheating violated our vows far more deeply than opening a laptop left unlocked on a coffee table ever could. I told her that privacy does not cover months of secret intimacy with another man while asking her husband for space to evaluate whether he is enough. Her defensiveness wavered. The anger drained from her tone and was replaced by something smaller. She admitted they had grown close. She said it started innocently, that she felt seen at work in a way she had not felt in a long time. She confessed that she liked the attention, that it made her feel attractive and interesting instead of predictable and settled. She insisted that nothing physical had happened, that they had not crossed that line. Then she added one word that carried more weight than the rest of the sentence. Yet, she said nothing physical had happened yet, as if that were a technicality rather than a boundary. The presence of that word made it clear that the possibility had not only existed, it had been entertained. The week she asked for was not about introspection. It was an opportunity. It was a pause button on our marriage while she explored whether a different life felt better. Hearing her say that nothing had happened yet did not comfort me. It echoed in my mind as proof that the door was already open and she had been standing on the threshold, deciding whether to step through. 2 days later, she showed up at the house unannounced, knocking in a way that was too soft to be confident and too urgent to ignore. And when I opened the door, she was standing there with swollen eyes, her makeup smeared, clutching her phone like it was the only stable thing left in her world. The confidence she had worn the night she left was gone, replaced with desperation that felt raw and unfiltered. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, looking around the living room as if expecting it to look different, as if something dramatic should have shifted in her absence. She started crying almost immediately, telling me she had made a mistake, that being away had made her realize she wanted me, that she could not imagine losing our life together. Her words tumbled over each other, frantic and breathless. I listened without raising my voice, without interrupting her, and when she finally paused, I told her calmly that realization born from a failed backup plan was not the same thing as loyalty. The sentence seemed to hit her harder than any accusation could have. She shook her head, insisting that it was not like that she had just been confused, that she had needed clarity. I told her clarity does not require secrecy. It does not require months of private conversations with another man or careful positioning, a so-called break. She sank onto the couch, hands trembling, and admitted that during the time she was away she had considered sleeping with Ethan, that the thought had been there, hovering, but she had not fully decided. That honesty, delivered in a broken voice, struck deeper than denial ever would have. It was not an impulsive, almost mistake. It was contemplation. It was evaluation. It was weighing options. She tried to frame it as loneliness, as emotional starvation, as a natural consequence of feeling unseen. She said Ethan had listened to her, that he made her feel interesting again, that she had not intended for things to escalate. I did not shout. I did not pace. I stayed seated across from her and explained that confusion does not send hundreds of messages. Loneliness does not accidentally schedule coffee meetups that your spouse never hears about. Feeling unseen does not justify redirecting every complaint about your marriage to another man instead of addressing it with your husband. I broke it down into what it actually was. Not abstract emotion, but a sequence of deliberate choices. Every text message typed and sent. Every inside joke cultivated. Every time she chose to talk to him about feeling bored instead of talking to me. Every moment she guarded her phone and built a private world that excluded me. None of that was accidental. None of it was confusion drifting in the air. It was intentional behavior repeated until it formed something real. She asked me what she could do to fix it, her voice small and strained, as if there were a specific task she could complete that would restore everything to its previous state. I told her that trust does not regenerate overnight the way an apology hopes it will. It does not return because someone cries at the door and says they choose you after exploring other possibilities. Trust is built quietly over time, and it collapses quickly when you discover that you were an option being evaluated rather than a partner being protected. That Saturday afternoon, I was not expecting anyone, and when the knock came, was firm but hesitant, like the person on the other side was reconsidering their decision with every second that passed. I opened the door and immediately recognized him from the photos on Lauren's social media, and the profile picture attached to months of messages. Ethan stood there in jeans and a button-down shirt, hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets, his posture tense and his expression strained. He did not look confident or triumphant. He looked like a man who had walked into a situation he no longer wanted to be part of. He introduced himself unnecessarily, his voice tight, and said he just wanted to clear the air. I stepped outside onto the porch and closed the door behind me, keeping the conversation contained. He began by saying nothing physical had happened between them. He repeated it twice, almost as if he needed me to believe it in order to believe himself. He said things had gotten close, that lines had blurred emotionally, but that he backed off once he realized she was serious about leaving me. The way he phrased it made it clear he had not expected her to actually dismantle her marriage. He had expected flirting validation, fantasy, not consequences. He admitted that his own ex-wife had left him years earlier for a co-worker, that he knew firsthand how destructive that dynamic could become, and that when Lauren started talking about permanently walking away from her marriage, he saw the pattern repeating. He said he did not want to be the man who stepped into someone else's life only to build something on top of someone else's ruins. There was a flicker of guilt in his eyes when he said it, but also a trace of self-preservation. He was not confessing out of loyalty to me. He was distancing himself from the fallout. Then he told me something that settled everything into place with brutal clarity. After I did not call Lauren, after I did not beg or chase or try to win her back, she began calling him repeatedly. He said she showed up at his apartment once unannounced, and that he did not let her inside. He described her as frantic, uncertain, wanting reassurance that he was still there. He said the tone shifted from flirtation to desperation once she realized I was not reacting the way she expected. The fantasy they had built in private messages, the idea of something thrilling and uncomplicated, collapsed under the weight of reality. Listening to him speak confirmed what I had already understood but had not yet heard stated plainly. She did not leave because she was certain she wanted him. She left because she wanted to test whether he would replace me seamlessly. When he hesitated, when he stepped back, when the promise of a smooth transition dissolved, she panicked. The break she framed as self-discovery became a void she had not anticipated. Without me chasing her and without him stepping forward, she was suspended between two unstable options. Ethan finished by saying he wanted no part in it anymore, and that he was transferring to another team at work to create distance. He looked relieved just to say it out loud, as a confessing absolved him of responsibility. I told him I appreciated the information, and nothing more. When he walked away down the path, shoulders slightly hunched, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The final illusion was gone. She had not chosen me first. She had not protected our marriage when temptation appeared. She had positioned me as a safe option, while exploring whether something more exciting would hold. And when that alternative disappeared, when the door she tried to open did not stay open for her, she returned not out of loyalty but out of loss. Hearing it directly from him removed any lingering doubt. I was not her first choice in that moment. I was the remaining one. The following Monday, I woke up earlier than usual, put on a pressed button-down shirt that I had not worn in months, and drove downtown to meet with a divorce attorney named Patricia Coleman, whose office overlooked one of the quieter streets in Charleston. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, and the calm professionalism of the reception area felt almost surreal compared to the emotional chaos of the week before. I sat across from Patricia in a conference room with clean lines and neutral walls, and I laid everything out in a measured, chronological way, from the request for space to the messages with Ethan to his unexpected visit at my door. She listened without interruption, occasionally jotting down notes, her expression neutral but attentive. The facts were simple. We had no children. Our shared assets were minimal, mostly the townhouse, which was in both our names, a joint savings account that was not substantial, and standard household belongings that could be divided without warfare. Patricia explained that in South Carolina, given the circumstances and the lack of complex entanglements, the paperwork could move relatively quickly if uncontested. Hearing it framed so plainly stripped the situation of drama. It was no longer a storm of emotion. It was a process, a legal dissolution of something that had already fractured. By the end of that week, the documents were drafted. I reviewed them carefully, signed where indicated, and authorized her proceed. When Lauren was formally served, her reaction came in waves of anger and disbelief. She called me repeatedly, her tone swinging from incredulous to wounded. She accused me of being dramatic, of escalating what she still insisted had been a temporary lapse in judgment. She said we should try counseling, that marriages survived worse, that I was refusing to fight for us. I reminded her calmly that she had already tried a different solution when she asked for a separation to test the possibility of someone else. Counseling is for people who confront problems together, not for someone who explores alternatives and returns when they collapse. The distinction mattered to me more than she seemed willing to understand. She framed the divorce as impulsive retaliation. I framed it as a consequence of deliberate choices she had already made over the next month. The separation became tangible. She moved into a small apartment in Greenville, far enough away to feel like a reset, but close enough to remain within the same orbit of our shared social circles. Not long after, she quit her job at Brightline Marketing. Word had spread internally, not just about the emotional entanglement, but about the way it unraveled publicly. Workplace rumors have a way of amplifying quiet mistakes into full narratives. An environment she once described as empowering had become suffocating. Among our mutual friends, the story shifted as more details surfaced. At first, there had been whispers that I had kicked her out, that I had reacted harshly to a request for space. That narrative unraveled once screenshots of her conversations with Ethan began circulating privately among those closest to us. I had not broadcast them widely, but I did not hide them when directly accused. The contrast between her public explanation and the documented reality dissolved the illusion quickly. People who had initially viewed me as cold or unforgiving began to see the sequence of events for what it was. By the time the month ended, the separation was no longer a dramatic standoff, but a quiet restructuring of two lives moving in different directions. The townhouse felt different without her presence, not empty but settled, as if the tension that once lingered in every room had finally dissipated. The legal process continued forward with steady predictability, and for the first time since that Tuesday in September, I felt something close to certainty rather than doubt. The divorce finalized in early January on a gray morning that felt almost anticlimactic compared to the chaos that had led up to it, and when Patricia called to confirm that everything had been processed and filed, I did not feel triumph or devastation, only a quiet sense of closure that settled into me like a long overdue exhale. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no last-minute pleas, just signatures stamped documents, and a legal acknowledgement that the marriage was over, for years reduced to paperwork and finality. On New Year's Eve, just days before it was official, I stood on a friend's rooftop overlooking the river in downtown Charleston. The air cold enough to sting my lungs, a plastic cup of bourbon in my hand, as fireworks burst above the water in sharp flashes of color. Around me, people laughed, counted down, kissed their partners at midnight, and for the first time in years, I was standing there as a single man. It felt strange but not hollow. There was no frantic ache in my chest, no impulse to reach for my phone and text her. There was only the steady awareness that this was not the ending I imagined when I married Lauren, but it was the ending that made sense. As the countdown hit 0 and the sky lit up, I realized something that had taken weeks of anger, disappointment, and reflection to articulate clearly. I would rather be alone than be someone's contingency plan. I would rather stand on a rooftop by myself, watching fireworks explode against the dark, than sit at home wondering whether I was a safe fallback option, while someone else tested alternatives. Loneliness is clean. Uncertainty inside a marriage is corrosive. When someone asks for space to decide whether you are enough, the decision has already begun to tilt. The request itself is evidence that the foundation is no longer solid. I did not lose my wife the night she walked out of the townhouse with her Navy suitcase rolling behind her. By that point, the fracture had already widened beyond repair. I lost her the moment she chose another man's validation over the vows we made. I lost her when she began redirecting her doubts to someone outside our marriage instead of facing them with me. By the time she stood in the doorway asking for a week to find herself, she had already stepped outside of what we had built. What I did in response was not dramatic or vengeful. I did not sabotage her career or humiliate her publicly. I did not beg, compete, or try to outperform another man for attention. The only thing I did was refuse to compete for a position I already held. A marriage is not an audition. It is not a contest where the incumbent must defend his role against new challengers. I had been her husband, not a candidate awaiting final approval. Standing there as the fireworks reflected on the river, I understood that I had not been discarded for someone better. I had simply been unwilling to remain in a situation where my value was being compared and measured against a hypothetical alternative. There's a certain dignity in walking away from that. The new year did not feel like a restart in the dramatic sense, but it did feel like clarity. I was not starting over because I failed. I was starting over because I chose not to accept being someone's second option disguised as reconciliation.